So picture the standard medieval movie, right? You know the exact aesthetic I am talking
Oh,
about.
absolutely. The grim stained walls, the heavy armor.
Exactly. It is always like knights clad in this heavy armor, kings making these grand sweeping declarations from a throne. And the women are, well, usually they're just standing quietly in the background.
Right, if they're even in the scene at all.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe they are locked in a tower, or at best, they are silently spinning wool while the men make history. It is a very specific, rigid, hyper-patriarchal image.
It really is.
Yes.
And it is incredibly pervasive in how we think about the past.
But today we are taking a depth dive into a stack of historical sources that, frankly, completely dismantle that picture for you. Our mission today is to explore the hidden lives and the very real, very potent power of women in the Byzantine Empire.
Yes, and I am so excited for this because the sources show us a society that is just remarkably different from that standard narrative.
I mean, we are looking at a society that produced brilliantly manipulative female historians, right? Women who essentially ran the urban banking sector.
hmm And even undercover monks who, like, fundamentally subverted the gender norms of their day.
It is wild.
Yeah.
So let's start with the obvious question. If all this evidence exists, why do we have this huge misconception in the first place?
Well, to understand that, we have to look at the historians who actually wrote the textbooks.
Hmm.
For the better part of the 19th and 20th centuries, scholars looked at the Byzantine Empire through their own very culturally restrictive lenses.
Right.
They basically operated on this assumption that Byzantine women only existed in what they called the private sphere.
Meaning what? Like just the domestic space?
Exactly. Hidden away at home, completely detached from politics, economics, or public life. But our goal today is to look at the actual material and textual evidence left by the Byzantines themselves.
I want to stop right there and just like unpack that historiography for a second, because looking at the notes, there are these massive foundational texts of Byzantine history.
You mean the ones by scholars like George Ostrogorsky?
Yes. Ostrogorsky in the 1950s or Cyril Mango later on. I mean, these are the canonical books you read in university, and they seemingly just skip over half the population.
They really do.
How does an academic look at an empire that lasted 1,000 years and decide the women just aren't worth mentioning?
It comes down to what those specific generations of scholars defined as history.
Yeah.
In the mid-20th century, traditional academia largely viewed history as just the study of military campaigns.
Battles and treaties, basically.
Right, the signing of treaties and the succession of male rulers. I mean, if you define power exclusively as a man holding a sword or signing a decree, you are inherently going to overlook the really sophisticated alternative networks of power that women utilized.
So they overlaid a very like 1950s Western European ideal of the stay-at-home wife onto an Eastern Mediterranean empire that existed a millennium ago.
That is exactly what they did.
Okay, let's be real. That feels like trying to review a movie. But you only watch the scenes with the male lead, and you assume the rest of the cast are just background extras. It gives you a completely incomplete picture.
A distorted picture, precisely.
Yeah.
When we step away from those modern textbooks and actually read the primary sources, the court chronicles, the tax codes, the religious texts, we see a reality where women were wielding immense authority.
And not just quietly from the shadows either.
No, not at all. Take the 6th century Empress Theodora. She is a prime example of a woman who was not merely some regent keeping the throne warm for a son.
Right, she functioned as a sovereign co-ruler alongside her husband, Emperor Justinian.
Yes. And Theodora's legislative record is just fascinating to read. She was enacting sweeping changes that directly impacted the lives of everyday women.
Like the rape laws, right? That stood out to me so much in the sources. She pushed through laws making the rape of any woman, and that included lower-class women and slaves punishable by death.
Which was a massive, radical shift from previous Roman law.
And she didn't stop there. She actively bought the freedom of young girls who had been forced into prostitution. But the part of her story that really made me pause is her religious policy.
Oh, the Miaphysite controversy.
Yes. Because Justinian was like the absolute champion of strict Orthodox Christianity, yet Theodora openly sympathized with this group called the Miaphysites, who had a fundamentally different theological view on the nature of Christ.
She actually funded a monastery for them.
That is what is so crazy to me. How does the wife of an autocratic Orthodox emperor get away with bankrolling the religious opposition?
Well, that is the perfect illustration of her independent power. Theodora had her own vast financial resources and her own network of political patronage. She didn't need Justinian's permission to fund the Miaphysites.
Wow.
Furthermore, historians debate the exact mechanics of this, but many argue Justinian tolerated it because it was a brilliant political strategy.
Really? How so?
By having the emperor strictly enforce orthodoxy, while the empress quietly protected and funded the dissenting Miaphysites, the imperial couple essentially kept both massive religious factions tethered to the throne.
Oh, wow. So she wasn't just being rebellious, she was literally managing half the empire's religious portfolio.
Exactly.
It was almost a good cop, bad cop dynamic, but played on this massive geopolitical scale. And if we move forward in the timeline, it is clear she wasn't a one-off anomaly.
Not at all.
Yeah.
If you look at the 11th century, we have two sisters, Zoe and Theodora, who ruled the empire solely.
The context for Zoe and Theodora is crucial, right? They were the very last living members of the Macedonian dynasty.
Yes. And to the Byzantine public, this bloodline had brought about a golden age of prosperity and military success. Legitimacy rested entirely in their DNA.
Which explains the public reaction to Zoe's marriages. Because the sources note she married 3 different times during her reign.
She did.
And in a system we assume is rigidly patriarchal, you would expect the new husband to simply take the crown and tell Zoe to step aside. But the citizens of Constantinople were fiercely loyal to her.
Oh, they were. When one of those husbands tried to sideline her and seize executive control, the public literally rioted in the streets until she was reinstated.
They basically said, no, you are just a guest in Zoe's house.
Precisely. And the Byzantines themselves were acutely aware of this dynamic. They encoded it right into their visual culture. If we want to know how they conceptualized female power, we just have to look at the physical evidence.
Like the mosaics.
Yes, consider the famous 6th century mosaics at the Basilica of San Vitale.
That is in Ravenna, Italy, right? Which Justinian had just reconquered.
That is correct. Ravenna was the newly reclaimed capital of Byzantine Italy, and the basilica was designed to project absolute imperial authority to a newly conquered population.
Okay, so a major propaganda piece.
Exactly. And in the apse of this church, there are 2 massive facing mosaic panels. One depicts Emperor Justinian and his retinue. The opposite panel depicts Empress Theodora and her retinue.
And they are portrayed as entirely equal, aren't they?
Completely equal. They're identical in height, their halos are the exact same size, and the sheer opulence of the purple porphyry and gold tiles used for Theodora is just staggering.
So there was no attempt to, like, shrink the empress to make the emperor look more dominant?
None at all. The visual message to the people of Italy was clear. You are ruled by a dual, equally potent authority.
I mean, if she were just a silent partner, you certainly wouldn't waste the most expensive mosaic tiles in the empire putting her face on the most important church wall in Italy.
Exactly.
Okay, so we see that women at the very apex of the pyramid, the empresses, held massive systemic power. But what if you were a woman born into the royal family, but you weren't the one wearing the crown? How did you exert influence?
Well, if you couldn't rule the empire, you might decide to shape how the empire was remembered instead. You pick up a pen.
Which leads us to one of the most compelling figures in Byzantine history.
The 12th century princess Anna Comnene. She is arguably one of the first female historians in the Western tradition.
Her upbringing alone sounds like it was designed to forge an intellectual powerhouse. I mean, she was born in 1083 in a room called the Porphyra.
Right, the Purple Room.
Yeah. For anyone listening who isn't familiar, this was a specific pavilion in the Great Palace, lined from floor to ceiling with ancient, incredibly rare purple porphyry stone. It was reserved exclusively for imperial birth to confer the ultimate legitimacy on the child.
So she was a Porphyrogenita, literally born in the purple.
And her education was just staggering. The records show she studied Aristotle, she read Homer, she mastered complex mathematics.
And she studied so much medicine that she was actually able to aggressively debate the royal doctors regarding her father's treatments when he was dying.
Which is incredible. Yet, despite that brilliance, the way modern history has treated Anna Comnene is deeply problematic.
It really is. For centuries, scholars and even prominent 20th century poets like Constantine Cavafy painted Anna as this bitter, jealous, power-hungry villain.
The standard narrative was that she was obsessed with seizing the throne from her brother John, right?
That was the story, yeah.
Yeah.
Supposedly, she orchestrated an assassination plot, failed miserably, and was banished to a monastery. And the myth claims she just sat in that monastery, consumed by resentment, and wrote her massive historical masterwork, the Alexiad, simply because her political life was over.
It feels incredibly dismissive. It essentially frames her intellectual achievement as a consolation prize for failing at politics.
It really does. But looking at the modern research in our sources, that entire narrative of the coup seems to be falling apart.
It's entirely unraveling. Recent scholarship suggests the coup is largely a modern fabrication.
Right. It stems from those same historians we discussed earlier, who projected their own discomfort with a powerful intellectual woman onto the past.
They couldn't reconcile her towering intellect with her gender, so they framed her as a scheming villain.
Exactly. In reality, Anna wrote the Alexiad freely, long after her husband had passed away, while actively participating in a really vibrant, sophisticated circle of scholars.
But she did face a massive cultural hurdle in writing that book, didn't she? Because, like, in the 12th century, the act of writing history was inherently political.
Oh, heavily political. History was the judgment of men's actions, military campaigns, and statecraft.
So for a woman to step into the public sphere and declare, I am the one who gets to decide how these men are remembered, that must have been seen as incredibly threatening to the male establishment.
It was perceived as deeply arrogant and subversive. It challenged the naturalized male authority of the era. I mean, if she had simply written a straightforward, objective history proclaiming her own expertise, male readers of the time would have likely rejected it outright.
They would have just dismissed it as the ramblings of a woman overstepping her boundaries.
Absolutely. Which brings us to the most brilliant part of her strategy.
Yes. When you read the Alexiad, there are these moments where Anna suddenly bursts into tears on the page. She dramatically laments her widowhood, she weeps over the tragedies of her life, and she writes these highly emotional passages.
Right. And for decades, male historians pointed to those passages and said, see, she's an emotional woman. She lacks the rational objectivity required to be a real historian.
But they completely missed the mechanism of what she was doing. She was building a Trojan horse.
That is a very apt way to describe it. She was deliberately enacting femininity, exactly as her 12th century culture defined it.
She knew her male readers expected a woman to be weak and emotional, so she gave them exactly what they wanted.
She did. By weeping on the page and adopting this persona of a piteous, suffering widow, she neutralized her own intellectual threat.
She manipulated her male audience into feeling a sense of condescending pity for her, and once they felt superior to her, their guard was down and they were willing to accept her authority as a historian.
She held a remarkable contradiction in deliberate tension. She figured out how to be the good, humble woman and the authoritative historian simultaneously.
She weaponized their own societal stereotypes to secure her legacy.
It is a masterclass in PR spin.
It really is. So, Anna hacked the intellectual sphere by using gender norms to her advantage. But our sources highlight another group of women who took the exact opposite approach.
Right.
Instead of using femininity as a tool, they hacked the Byzantine system by attempting to erase their gender entirely.
To understand this phenomenon, we have to transition into the spiritual realm, which was, frankly, the absolute bedrock of Byzantine society.
There was a profound daily paradox at the heart of their theology, wasn't there?
There was. On one hand, women were denigrated as the daughters of Eve. They were viewed as inherently weak, prone to sin, and ultimately responsible for the fall of humanity.
Right. But simultaneously, the culture elevated a woman as the ultimate role model. Mary, the Mother of God, the literal vehicle for humanity's salvation.
Exactly. How does a society function with that level of cognitive dissonance?
I mean, you are told daily that your nature is the root of all sin, but you are also commanded to emulate the Holy Mother of the universe. To navigate that impossible standard, it seems some women took the most extreme paths to holiness imaginable.
The sources list these radical ascetic lives, right?
Yeah, like women walking into the desert to live in complete isolation for decades. Or an abbess renowned for supposedly slaying a dragon. Or a nun who escaped captivity to live alone on the abandoned island of Paros.
These stories of extreme physical deprivation and asceticism were wildly popular in Byzantine culture. The underlying mechanism here is the mortification of the flesh.
Meaning they were trying to punish their bodies.
Right. By starving the body and living in harsh conditions, these women were perceived to be burning away their inherently sinful female nature. But the most fascinating iteration of this is the phenomenon of the female saints who adopted male disguises.
Yes, the undercover monks. I was reading the case studies on figures like St. Eugenia and St. Athanasia. These were women who cut their hair, put on male robes, and lived for years inside all-male monasteries. How did the church, which was so rigidly segregated, process this?
It requires us to look at the theology of late antiquity. In this era, Virility and masculinity were not just biological categories. They were inextricably linked with spiritual perfection, strength, and virtue.
Okay. And conversely, femininity was synonymous with spiritual poverty and bodily weakness.
Exactly. Several prominent church fathers argued that the only way for a woman to truly achieve salvation was to transcend her femininity and become male in spirit.
Wow. So when a woman like St. Eugenia puts on a monk's habit, she isn't just sneaking into a boys' club for convenience?
No, not at all. She is making a profound theological statement. She is visually manifesting her spiritual transformation.
By donning male disguises, these women bypass the heavy societal restrictions placed upon the daughters of Eve.
Precisely. Within the walls of the monastery, living as men, they achieved a level of autonomy, respect, and equal status that would have been completely inaccessible to them in the secular world.
And society admired them for it.
Yes, because they were imitating what the culture deemed the superior sex
Yeah.
in order to grasp a holiness that was theoretically out of their reach.
They basically looked at the theological rules, found the single loophole that equated masculinity with holiness, and utilized it to achieve total spiritual parity. It is brilliant.
It really is.
But I want to pivot here because, all of these examples, Empress Theodora, Princess Anna Komnene, radical saints, these are the absolute elites or the extreme exceptions of society.
Right. What about the rest of the population?
Exactly. If you are listening to this and wondering, what about the average person? What was life like for the woman who wasn't born in a palace and wasn't fleeing to a desert monastery? What was the everyday woman doing?
The everyday woman is often the hardest to track in historical records. But recent Greek research into Byzantine economic and legal documents completely shatters the idea that average women were just confined to the home.
The market records show that women were deeply, visibly, and aggressively involved in the retail economy.
They weren't just participating in the market, they were managing substantial portions of it. The sources show them owning bakeries, running inns, and operating grocery shops.
But the statistic that truly stopped me in my tracks was about the financial sector. The research indicates that by the 14th century, women accounted for up to 75% of those involved in money lending within the urban aristocracy.
Up to 75%. It is a staggering number.
Wait, 75%? How did a medieval society evolve a system where women were the primary bankers? I mean, that is higher than Wall Street today.
It really comes down to the mechanics of Byzantine dowry law, specifically a legal code from the 8th century called the ekloga.
Okay, the ekloga. What did that do?
Unlike many other medieval Western European societies, where a woman's property was immediately absorbed by her husband upon marriage, Byzantine women maintained absolute legal ownership of their dowries.
So if a woman enters a marriage with a substantial amount of gold or property, the husband can't just spend it.
Exactly. It remains her asset. That gives her liquid capital to invest and lend.
They had the capital and they had the legal framework protecting it.
Yes. The ekluga gave women significant teeth in the courtroom. Beyond just property, it also granted women the right to demand a divorce under very specific circumstances.
Chiefly, if the husband committed treason against the state or if he was proven to be impotent.
Right. Treason or impotence.
That is a very, very specific line in the sand. Why those two things specifically?
It reveals what the Byzantine state truly valued. Treason is a direct threat to the security of the empire. Impotence is a direct threat to the stability of the household.
Because it prevents the production of legitimate heirs.
Exactly. Which dictates the flow of property and wealth. The law recognized that a woman had a fundamental right to a functional marriage that provided security and lineage.
So if the husband failed in his duty to the state or his duty to the family bloodline, the woman was legally empowered to dissolve the contract and take her money back.
Precisely. That is a staggering level of legal agency for the time.
And there is one more piece of physical evidence regarding women in the economy that I want to ask you about, because the sources mention these 5th and 6th century shipyard weights.
Oh yes, the commercial weights. These were heavy bronze or brass weights used by merchants in the ports to measure massive quantities of goods. Grain, spices, silks, for major economic transactions.
It was how you ensured you were getting what you paid for.
Right. It was a standard measure.
And the sources note that many of these weights were cast in the shape of the busts of empresses. Why would the government put the face of a woman on the very tools used to regulate commerce?
It is a question of public trust. To the Byzantine citizen, the image of the empress wasn't merely decorative. The female imperial image was culturally understood as the ultimate symbol of fairness, equity, and justice.
Wow.
When a merchant weighed a massive shipment of grain, the face of the empress on that weight functioned as a state-backed guarantee that the transaction was honest.
That is profound. The very bedrock of their daily economy, the literal physical measure of fairness and trust in the marketplace, was the face of a woman.
It really shifts our perspective, doesn't it?
It completely changes the game. So let's bring all of this together.
Sure.
The next time you see a piece of media that tries to feed you the old narrative, the one where medieval history is just men doing important things with swords while women wait passively in the wings, I want you to remember the reality of the Byzantine Empire.
Absolutely.
Remember Empress Theodora manipulating geopolitics and funding rival sects? Remember Anna Komnene using the societal expectation of female weeping as a PR strategy to cement her intellectual legacy?
And remember the undercover saints who bypassed restrictive theology.
Yes, and the everyday women who held the capital, controlled the dowries, and literally ran the local economy.
It requires a total reframing of how we view historical power. And I want to leave you with one final detail to consider as we wrap up today.
Please do.
We discussed Anna Komnene, the brilliant historian, earlier. But look a generation earlier to her grandmother, Anna Dalasina.
Okay.
When her son, Emperor Alexios, had to leave the capital to fight a war, he didn't appoint a male general or a council of men to govern in his absence. He handed total administrative and economic control of the Byzantine state to his mother.
Wow. She ruled the empire.
She ruled it, the ultimate matriarch. But her most fascinating power play wasn't just ruling, it was how she named herself.
What do you mean?
In all her official capacities, Anna Dalasina purposefully utilized her mother's maiden surname. She completely dropped her father's family name.
Really? Why?
Because the matriarchal side of her family simply carried more political weight, more prestige, and more power.
That is incredible. In a society we are constantly told was rigidly patriarchal, the most powerful flex the acting ruler of the empire could make was a matriarchal name drop.
Exactly. It proves that the levers of power in Byzantium were complex, deeply intertwined with lineage and competence, and certainly not restricted to men. Something for you to chew on as you go about your day.
I think that perfectly encapsulates our deep dive today. That historical X-ray machine we used to use, the one that neatly divided the past into men's public power and women's private lives, it's completely broken.
It's obsolete.
When you look closely at the evidence, the Byzantine landscape is gloriously complex, and women were driving the narrative the entire time.